fantastic lineup. We really did want to start this day with the topic of understanding a little bit more about the wider global landscape, global trends, new frontiers, and updates on the non-state online threat landscape. Why? Why is that the most important topic of the day? I think, well, when we at GIFCT, for those of you that don't know me, I'm Erin Saltman. I'm the Director of Membership and Programming at GIFCT. Our main stakeholder is to try to get tech companies to a better place in being more proactive in countering terrorism and violent extremism online. As you heard from our Executive Director, we have to not only provide tools, but a moderation tool, when turned on, can surface hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of pieces of content to a moderator all over the world. And without understanding the context of what that content means and not understanding why that piece of content might relate to a dangerous organization or a violent extremist group, we're going to get a lot of errors and mishaps. And so I can provide all the best, most beautiful tools in the universe, and without the research context to understand what those symbols mean, what a certain group is using as coded language, that tool really means nothing. It also, context helps us understand what a false positive might be, why a journalist network might be using coded language, or why an activist group might be using a slogan, and why that shouldn't be considered violent extremist terminology. And that is where all the qualitative, beautiful research needs to sit around all the quantitative tooling and resources that we provide on the more technical side, so that they can work together to make sure that we're actually getting at the threat, that we're not over-censoring, but we're also not under-monitoring. And this is, of course, a Sisyphean task. So no one sector, no one company, no one government can do this together. So this sort of cross-sector multi-stakeholderism is extremely challenging. It is not easy. It is much easier to be a dictator in the room and just say what you want to get done, but it also will not get you the results that you want. So by convening GNET, by having researchers contribute so that we have that understand work that can sit around the technology and the tech companies, this is a really important partnership. And so many, many thanks to GNET, many thanks to Alex, Fola, Belle, and Joanna for making this ship sail. I mean, blown away even just this year alone, 2024. GNET's already produced, Belle, this is probably even outdated from last week, 47 insights covering 15 countries, authors from 21 nationalities, 3 webinars. These are just 2024 statistics, so it's pretty good. And we're kind of packaging it and sharing this with tech companies, but we've also had outreach from governments around the world mentioning that they're reading all these insights, that they find it really useful for context too. So we want to be that translator between sectors, bringing researcher voices to the other sectors so that that context really does land home. And I get to sit up here with my beautiful panelists and just sound clever by being around them, which is the best job being moderator, and talk about alt-right politics of truth. I mean, I have so many questions already, you guys. The adoption and growth of Hindutva ideologies in India, the rise of ISKP as a transnational threat, and the Hamas and Houthi use of online propaganda since 10/7. Let's hit hard with the morning session if we shall. So without further ado, I'd love us to start off with Dr. Beatriz Buarque. And Dr. Buarque studied at the University of Manchester, PhD in politics from the University of Manchester, currently working as a fellow at the London School of Economics with an expertise in alt-right politics of truth. And I'd love to pass it over to you to explain to us a little bit more about your context, what you mean with that sort of framing, how that relates to violent extremist and terrorist threat. And I think you've broken this down into kind of 3 global trends you've observed that maybe will help us wrap our head around what seems to be as well that nexus between misinformation and extremism. Over to you.
Thank you. Okay, so first of all, Erin, thank you so much for this invitation. It is really a pleasure to be here with you all to speak about the alt-right politics of conspiratorial truth. So before I start, unfortunately, I have a warning, and some of the images that I'm going to show may be disturbing, and I would like to ask you to do not take pictures of slides containing images because I'm going to share some sensitive information, okay? So, as Erin just said, I'm going to basically highlight 3 global trends that are intertwined. I won't have time to delve into them, so I'm more than happy to continue discussions during the breaks. So the first one is the wide circulation of outright conspiracy theories as truth across different online spaces. The second one, synergies between the outright and the broader spectrum of the far right. And finally, the impact of AI on the politics of truth enacted by the far right and the outright. So by outright, I mean this international set of groups and individuals whose core belief is that white identity is under threat. I'm basically talking about this digital, amorphous, heterogeneous social body. And one of the key features of the outright is that it's not really into partisan politics. Its primary goal is to change the way people think about politics by enacting its own politics of truth. And by truth, I mean conspiratorial truth, because conspiracy theories is really at the heart of the outright. When I say that this belief that white identity is under attack is what brings these individuals and groups together, conspiracy theories, they function as the vehicle to convey, to transmit this belief. So that's why this phenomenon is essentially conspiratorial and committed to its own politics of truth. Yes, so in my doctoral studies, I examined how and why outright conspiracy theories have been legitimized in online space. And I basically looked at 4 conspiracy theories that are often found in outright circles. And I examined how they have been performed and circulated as truth. So the first trend is that digital platforms have basically facilitated the authoritative performances of outright conspiracy theories. Today, one can find these conspiracy theories performed as truth in a myriad of ways, through conferences, documentaries, interviews, something that I call intellectual talks, which are those videos in which an intellectual is speaking to the camera as if they were speaking to the public. So it's very easy to find all these formats. And one thing that I would like to highlight here is that when we talk about conspiracy theories, we often have this misconception that, oh, figures like Alex Jones and influencers are the main ones who are spreading conspiracy theories. I'm not really concerned about these individuals. I'm primarily concerned about really intellectuals, individuals who use like academic credentials or individuals who are actually academics and who have used this authority to perform conspiracy theories as truth. And besides facilitating the performance of conspiracy theories as truth, digital platforms have also facilitated the wide circulation of these discourses. So I used these 15 videos containing authoritative performances of outright conspiracy theories as primary object of investigation. And then I checked how they were reproduced across different platforms. Here in this slide, you have an example of one of these videos. It is a documentary about the Great Replacement Theory, and a documentary in very derogatory terms that dehumanizes immigrants. This documentary is still available on YouTube, and it was shared on Meta, X, different forums, different websites in different languages. And then somebody may ask, okay, but the simple fact that it was shared does not mean that people are endorsing this conspiracy theory, right? But among all these shares, only one tweet was making an explicit attempt to debunk the conspiracy theory. All the others, many of them were endorsing, some of them were just sharing. And the thumbnail is basically reinforces this essence of truth. So in a nutshell, while examining the legitimation of outright conspiracy theories, what I discovered was that They have been widely performed as truth, circulated, so identified over 8,000 shares. And the politics of truth enacted by the alt-right is not limited to digital realms. We are also talking about conferences. We are also talking about public lectures. We are also talking about courses. They are all going on right now. And we are also talking about books that remain available on Amazon. The second trend is that I identified some synergies between the alt-right and the broader spectrum of the far-right. And I noticed that these authoritative performances of conspiracy theories that have functioned as sort of discursive bridges between the alt-right and the broader spectrum of the far-right. So, for instance, we have today a grassroots organization in the UK called Patriotic Alternative, and it has produced educational material that is basically, essentially conspiratorial. They have performed like cultural Marxism, white genocide, great replacement theory as truth, and provided material for parents to educate children based on these truths. The second one is Countercurrents, is a publishing house widely associated with the alt-right. It presents material from the Nouvelle Droite alongside authoritative performances of conspiracy theories. And the third one is from the Global South, Brazil. We're talking about Brasil Paralelo, which is a journalistic, entertainment, and educational enterprise that has consistently produced cultural Marxism as truth in a myriad of formats. So we are talking about courses, we're talking about podcasts, we're talking about documentaries, and we are also talking about workshops delivered by them in schools to educate children about the supposed indoctrination that is happening in Brazilian schools. Finally, the third trend is the impact of the AI on the circulation and performance of conspiracy theories as truth. This is something that I may turn my attention to in the next years. So the first one is, while conducting some searches, while conducting some research with generative AI, I asked one of these apps, what is cultural Marxism? And this app is an educational app that was actually designed to help students with their homework. And this is the definition that the app provided. Cultural Marxism refers to a theory that combines elements of cultural studies and Marxist theory, when in fact, cultural Marxism is not at all a field of expertise, let alone a school of thought. The second one is really worrisome, and this is something that I came across while actually examining the nexus between algorithms and violence while paying attention to TikTok in Brazil, is the usage of artificial intelligence to produce Disney-like animations to appeal to a younger audience. I noticed this trend while looking at TikTok in Brazil, but a friend of mine actually told me that what has recently become viral on TikTok is this sort of Disney-like animation that presents Hitler as a hero and romanticizes the Holocaust. One may say, okay, TikTok very likely may have taken down, yes, but this Disney-like animation is still available on YouTube right now. I've just conducted a search a few minutes ago. So yes, these are the very worrisome global trends that I would like to talk about here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Beatriz. And I think it kind of sets a stage for that nexus between misinformation, conspiracy, and what starts mainstreaming violent extremists, what starts as the fringes and what we're seeing mainstreamed through what is increasingly kind of centralizing rhetoric or things that we think are all right. And definitely an area that we can get to in the Q&A that's very hard to build policies around, because it's very hard to define misinformation fully, or then have a definable and a defendable and a scalable policy to act upon it. So maybe we'll grill it on you a little bit more of like, in your dream world, what would the policy be that helps us get at some of this, or how can we tackle it a little bit more. Leading us into maybe you covered US, UK, Brazil. Let's go to another part of the world. Let's see what we should be concerned about and where we maybe have some solutions. David Kashankar Grandpierre, I'd love to turn over to you again. Oh, who's coming in? Voice of God? Not yet. Devika, you studied at the Symbiosis International University. You're the co-founder of JSG Strategy. That's a firm dedicated to designing impactful solutions to foster trusted digital spaces. You also work at TikTok on investigation and disruption of covert influence operation, and at Meta's risk mitigation team, safeguarding the Indian online ecosystem during critical events, including a variety of protests, Indian general elections, and during COVID-19. And you are going to speak to us a little bit more about the adoption and growth of Hindutva ideology in India. And so without further ado, I'd love to hand it over to you to tell us a little bit more about your research findings.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Erin. I'm really excited to be here to talk to you all about the emergence, adoption, and growth of Hindutva as an ideology over the past couple of decades and its digital footprint. We're going to talk about each of those things very quickly, so stay with me. The first ever attempt to study the religious makeup of India was an attempt at a census by the British government in the 1870s. This attempt was broadly understood to be a failure because the rigid classification of the census did not quite fit the fluid religious identity of Indians at the time. In response to this attempt at classification,
There might just be a lag on it.
in response to the attempts at classification, as well as the growing influence of Western education on young people in India at the time, Indian cultural leaders started to begin to define what is a Hindu or who is an Indian around the 1870s as well. This really grew arms and legs around the 1920s with V.D. Savarkar's seminal work, where he attempted to define who is a Hindu. So according to him, a Hindu or an Indian is someone who fits two categories. Number one, you need to be born in India. And number two, you need to be following a religion which also originated in India. This is interesting and a key point of distinction because according to this definition, that means that individuals who might have been born in India but followed Islam or Christianity or any other religion which did not originate in India, according to him, would not be part of the Hindu fold. So this idea of this cultural unified identity captured the hearts and minds of many leaders at the time. One of them was K.B. Hedgewar, the gentleman on the left there, and he really took this ideology and ran with it and created the first Hindu nationalist organization of its kind called RSS, or Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh. This organization was set up as a network of volunteers who had their own uniforms, their own standard operating practices, and engaged in a wide variety of social and welfare reforms. So this organization, RSS, would continue to have significant impact on India's next couple of decades and the growth of this ideology, because RSS will go on to inspire and spawn a family of similar organizations who all share this common definition of who should be a Hindu. The key one to take note here in 1980 was RSS spawn of Bharatiya Janata Party, created in 1980, which, as all of you would know, is the current ruling party in power in India. So as we continue with story time, the first real taste of power of institutional endorsement for the Hindutva ideology came with BJP coming into power briefly in 1996, and then properly between 1999 and 2004, under the leadership of this gentleman on the right, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who was a lifelong RSS member. you can begin to see the echoes of the definition of Hindutva in multiple policies proposed by the government at that time. So to quickly recap, as an ideology, Hindutva goes back to colonial and post-colonial times. At the point of 1990s, there was already a strong network of volunteers and organizations who, in various bits and pieces, really believed in this ideology and wanted to further that. 1990s were a very interesting time to be alive in India. I was born then. So in addition to liberalization and globalization, foreign direct investment, a huge influx of new media, it was also the time when these organizations sort of started to set up their first ever online and digital presences. Fast forward a couple of decades, when we look back at the online activity of these organizations and their affiliates, we see broadly there are two strategies in use. Both of these strategies are pretty much in line with their offline real-world activities as well. So number one is amplifications of points of view, which closely align with the core belief of who should be a Hindu and who is not a Hindu. So this essentially is a litany of perceived threats to Hindu unity from external influences, other religions, other members who are attempting to take over the Hindu demography. Equally important, and in recent days a lot more successful, is the attempts at suppressing any counter-narrative or critique or questioning of the base definition of who should be a Hindu. At this point, we'll go on to look at a few examples, some of it might be hard to watch, of each of these tactics in play and the timelines that they kind of were used. Doxing as a tactic, it's been around at this point for a long time. Sharing of personal information of individuals who might have married outside of Hinduism as a way to censor that behavior is the first time we see this reported more widely started at around 2018 with a page dedicated to do so. In addition to, of course, sharing of private information online, this also meant that these individuals had significant offline impact in the real world as well. Roughly around this time, if we look at number of advertisements, political advertisements in India, which used the terminology of Hindutva, we see a significant increase from 2019 onwards. So at this point, this is indicative of the start of money being spent to further propagate the ideology in a political context. An example from earlier this month, we can see this is an advertisement which showcases the current Prime Minister having visited the house or entity of one of the original propagators of Hindutva ideology. If you look at the information that's available about this ad, you will see that it links to this domain, indiancompass.com. And if you look up indiancompass.com, you will see that it appears to be a legitimate social interest page. That's the extent of information that you have publicly available at this point. Roughly 2017, 2018, 2019 is when traditional news media outlets in India also started to report on coordinated inauthentic behavior involving multiple sort of dark public relations firms and IT firms who are engaged in amplifying the certain political viewpoints in India. Some digital platforms also took those operations down and have publicly attributed them to either the specific political party or the relevant technology firms that were supporting the propagation of that theory. This recent example from 2023 also features an example from this month, Indian Compass. While Indian Compass appears to be a legitimate social interest page, according to the report from 2023, it's actually part of a content farm that is centrally managed and operated, which means some of the discourse, as recent as today, is very likely the result of a coordinated push. Along with the increase in funding, we also see big budget movies, which also align very closely with the idea of perceived threats to the Hindu identity. So these are just 3 examples, each of them talking about one of those perceived threats around what happened in Kashmir, around what happens with love jihad in India, as well as glorification of leaders of RSS. What ties them all together is all these movies were made tax exempt, which means a degree of state endorsement. Additionally, various very prominent leaders, including at the highest levels, endorsed these movies as the source of truth. It would be of no surprise to anyone that with the availability of easy creation of visuals, use of AI by these organizations and their sort of affiliate digital footprint to tell stories that didn't happen or to completely revise history is also a common theme at this point. Often these new stories or new versions of stories are often set to very exciting, catchy, rhythmic, pumping music, which is an entire new subgenre of music called Hindutva pop or H-pop. And what makes it really difficult is that in addition to appealing to a young audience, the lyrics of the songs, however catchy they might be, are extremely incendiary, such as India belongs to Hindus, pimps go to Pakistan, and much worse. And the key thing to be aware of is that they're all available wherever you might get your sort of digital podcasts. They're available on every platform and they're monetized. And one step up from doxing is also the concept of online raids, which are essentially coordinated attacks on individuals with the intent of getting them to censor their own speech. There are many examples of where this offline apparatus of network of volunteers meets the online footprint. We have examples where online activity leads to offline arrests of individuals who might have made a comment that was not in alignment. We have regional leaders who are accused of, and in some cases, even convicted of hate crimes, continuing to have online presences, as well as use of multiple digital platforms for fundraising of online and offline vigilantism, which is aligned with the ideology. Indian social media platforms continue to face pretty much exactly the same challenges. So the real challenge in moderating and mitigating these risks are, number one, in order to mitigate content risks in India, you need an army of people who understand the language as well as the context. Secondly, it's hard to automate who sort of the minority languages, which may be less popular. And the real big risk, in my opinion, is also businesses need to weigh up continuing to have a business in India versus moderating points of view, which may be viewed favorably by the state. So that's the end of my quick sprint through Hindutva. Looking forward to questions at a later point. Thank you.
I think it's very telling that although you guys are talking about extremely different parts of the world, we see some immediate trends of overlap in this kind of in real time historical revisionism of the now and kind of reinterpreting older history with new moments and what they should be considered. And I'm sure we can dive into that a little bit more in Q&A, but definitely also one that poses a conundrum when we think of, what are the policies we can tie around this to get to a better place? Where can we regulate? Where does something cross a line? Where do we need better counter narratives to break through some of these spectrums? I'm sure we can pick up on some of this. Do we have Lucas and Erin online? Great. Speaking to you in the ether, Lucas and Erin. Lucas Weber, I'm going to go to you next. I'm really looking forward to, again, changing it up even further in how we're going to be taking on the world and getting different regional perspectives. For those of you that don't know, Lucas Weber is a researcher focused on geopolitics and violent non-state actors. He has a master's in international relations and national security studies at the University of New Brunswick, but also the co-founder of Militant Wire, which perhaps some of you subscribe to and read. It's a media company focusing on providing independent analysis of militant activity and armed conflict in different parts of the world. He is also an editor and contributor to the West Point CTC and contributes to a range of other publications. So please do check out his work. And Lucas, I'm going to turn to you right now and Again, flipping over, we've covered some of the white supremacy movements and alt-right in America, looking at UK and Brazil. We've covered the Hindutva movement in India. You and Erin and Zelin are going to focus a little bit more on Islamist extremist threats that we're tracking. And you have a good focus on the rise of ISKP as a transnational threat and have been looking at some of their propaganda and operational visions and ambitions that have been coming out in recent time. Would love to pass it over to you to tell us a little bit more.
Thank you. Is my audio fine?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. I'm unable to start my video. I don't know if you'd like to enable that.
We'll have Belle, the master of all digital space. Not possible for you.
All right.
Do you want to get started and she'll see if we can work out your video as we go? Are you able to share your screen for slides?
I'm not right now, no, sorry.
You make them co-host.
Okay. Thanks for having me. I'm going to keep my presentation short as I am under the weather at the moment. But my talk will focus on the rise of the Islamic State Khorasan province, which is the Islamic State's Afghanistan-Pakistan branch, as well as its rapid emergence as the most globally minded and ambitious IS branch in terms of propaganda production and the international security threat due to its transnational activities. So what I'll do is I'll briefly explain ISK's history, its expanded transnational doctrine, and how the group has leveraged social media, messaging applications, and fundraising activities using cryptocurrencies to implement its new strategy, which was exemplified in at least 3 external operations in 2024. In terms of the latter, which is important and most relevant to the international security and threat to the West, there are 3 developments which kind of spurred and accelerated this trend. This includes the US withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, the outbreak of the Israel-Hamas conflict in October 2023, and ISKP's involvement in at least 3 external operations beginning in early January of this year. So the Islamic State Khorasan province emerged in 2015, perhaps late 2014, as an official affiliate of the Islamic State, based in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region. It initially drew recruits from a range of sources, including disaffected members of the Pakistani and Afghan Taliban, former Al-Qaeda members, and more. ISKP, it poses a unique threat due to its doctrine and international vision, and it showed this early on with savviness in being able to bolster its ranks by forging strategic alliances with existing local groups. Okay, thank you. And this included the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan and others, and this allowed it to establish operational and logistical networks. ISKP's activities kind of ebbed and flowed in the years after its emergence in 2014, 2015, but the suicide bombing against American soldiers in August of 2021 during the withdrawal inaugurated its new phase, the strategic activity we're seeing now with its targeting of international and foreign interests in its region of operations in Afghanistan and Pakistan, as well as its external operations. So essentially, the bombing at the Kabul airfield was the first major incident in this new phase, as the group began to regroup its dispersed forces, expand its recruitment and propaganda activities, and recover from its territorial losses. ISKP rolled out a multilingual propaganda campaign apparatus. It aggressively promoted its diverse militant base to broaden its reach. It would glorify what it calls martyrs from various ethno-linguistic backgrounds to kind of appeal to specific target audiences. ISKP has expanded its propaganda apparatus to the point where it now produces audio, video, and online print content in more languages than any other branch since the networks in Iraq and Syria at the height of the caliphate. This kind of enables ISK to achieve greater success in building support, recruiting, fundraising from a broader and more diverse range of population segments. This kind of reorientation towards a strategy of regionalization and internationalization consists of three main components, and this includes multilingual, high-volume propaganda production, the targeting of foreign interests and nationals in Afghanistan and Pakistan, as well as building out its external operations capabilities and intensifying its efforts to incite supporters to violence abroad, including in the West. Within its operational insurgency theater, ISK followed up the bombing of American soldiers with rocket attacks into Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, operations against the Pakistani and Russian embassies, an assault targeting Chinese nationals at a Kabul hotel, a suicide bombing targeting a Chinese diplomatic delegation at the Taliban's foreign ministry building, and an attack just this month that killed Western tourists in Afghanistan. And operationally, this has been paired with resources to build up its external operations capabilities, its activities abroad, its ability to project power and influence abroad. And this has been exemplified by the attacks in 2024 in Iran, Turkey, and Moscow. So essentially, ISKP has intensified its efforts to mobilize and incite its supporters to violence. But this was supercharged following the Hamas raid on Israel on October 7th. The Islamic State began an aggressive push to exploit sentiments that were stirred up by the attack and the military response by Israel. And essentially, the Islamic State Khorasan province has sought to capitalize on this and kind of compound the effects, and it has become an additional pole and vector in the Islamic State's general campaign. So this is taking place within an increasingly complex and challenging environment. The Islamic State's central media apparatus, its leadership, has found renewed success in inciting supporters to violence in the West. We've seen attacks in France, Belgium, Switzerland, and Australia, for instance. And ISKP has sought to kind of ride this momentum and take it in its own direction with some degree of autonomy. It's become an additional polar vector for this campaign. It's been translating Islamic State Central's propaganda content into English and other languages, its spokesman speeches, for instance, and it's published its own strategic and tactical literature and content in its magazine. For instance, it published a infographic which was titled "Practical Ways to Confront the Jew" after October 7th, and this posed a situation where its followers are obligated to conduct attacks. It gave tactical advice such as weapon selection, target selection, and so on. And this was again accelerated in the period encompassing the Iran attack, Turkey attack, and especially the Moscow attack. It has sought to ride this momentum. And after the Moscow attack, which kind of exemplified and illustrated its growing external operations reach, the Islamic State Khorasan province has actually kicked off a new Western and specifically European targeted campaign. And ISKP has existing networks and influence in the West. It's been able to reach diaspora communities and so on with its Uzbek and Tajik language propaganda, its English language magazines, and so on. So in Europe, particularly in Germany, we've seen several plots foiled by security services over the past few years, with many of these being front-loaded more recently. We've seen at least 3-4 plots foiled in Germany, and after the Moscow attack, French President Macron noted that at least two plots were foiled this year in France by ISK. And essentially, the Islamic State Khorasan province threat to the West is significant and it's growing. And after the Moscow attack, more Western governments and security services have recognized this reality and are taking steps and allocating resources to address it. But I will end this kind of presentation by noting that ISKP's success and its reliance on the internet, on social media and messaging applications, raising funds using cryptocurrency and other means, also leaves it highly vulnerable to disruption, where governments, experts, NGOs, and so on can coordinate and collaborate to undermine these operations that are purposed to grow its reach, influence, build support, recruit, and fundraise. And essentially, this allows experts and governments to undermine these efforts and disrupt ISK. This is paired with regional coordination to degrade ISKP in its theater of insurgencies. So there is opportunity here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucas. And it kind of takes us over from a series of groups and movements that are maybe harder to prescribe and designate or mainstream over to some of these groups that are internationally recognized as designated terrorist entities. And even in those spaces, we haven't fully solved the issue and are still watching these adversarial shifts. I know as well, for many of us, the news hasn't been focusing on IS and its various affiliates for a while. There's so much going on in the world, and it seems like in those moments, these groups really hunker down, revise strategy, and try to keep their networks alive in various means. So really interesting to hear you talk through some of ISKP's transnational continued threat and where there are some efforts to still make sure that we're tackling that. And it leads us into a really nice segue for our final speaker of this panel, Dr. Erin Zelin. Erin, I know you're with us online virtually, but for those of you that don't know Erin as well, he completed his doctorate here at King's College London, so welcome back, and currently works as a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy as a visiting research scholar in the Department of Politics at Brandeis University. He's also the founder of the online resource Jihadology, which some of you might be familiar with, and in the last couple of years published his book, Your Sons Are at Your Service, Tunisia's Missionaries of Jihad. So pick that up if you haven't already, and is currently working on a second book on the history of Syrian jihadism. So more to come to add to your library. I know I'll be getting it as well. And we wanted to bring you here into this dialogue to talk a bit more about specifically Hamas and the Houthis and how they've used technology and propaganda online, specifically since the 10/7 attacks and what that looks like. I'd love to hear more about what you've been tracking.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I'm currently in a hotel actually in Lisbon for another conference. They changed their dates. So if there's any noise in the background for whatever reason, I apologize about that. So I'm going to try and share my slides here. So when Maddie asked me to do this presentation on Hamas and the Houthis after the October 7th attacks, I thought it would be an interesting opportunity to look at some of their online activities over the last, 7-8 months or so, especially since after the October 7th attacks, I decided to create sort of a sister website to Jihadology and created one called Muqawamology, essentially a derivative of Muqawama, which just means resistance, in reference to sort of the axis of resistance, the Iran-led sort of alternative order that they're trying to create in the broader Middle East with its various proxy groups. I wanted to note that this presentation is primarily going to be focusing on their Arabic language content. However, for those interested in their content in other languages, such as English, specifically related to Hamas, I'd recommend looking at some of the research as well as writings from my colleague at the Washington Institute, Devorah Margolin. So I think one of the interesting things about this is that there's a lot of similarities to what you see in the types of propaganda products from what most people have typically looked at over the last 20 years when you're looking at extremism or terrorism issues in the Middle East, primarily from the global jihadi movement, whether it's Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State or other smaller organizations. And while they have their own sort of internal logic, I think it's important to note that while I'm talking about specifically Hamas and the Houthis as separate organizations, they are part of this wider resistance axis that Iran leads. And there is some, overlap in relation to some of the propaganda that's used or the way that they interact with one another online and in their messaging. So for example, on the left side, you see this graphic created where you have the Hamas fighter in the green, the Hezbollah fighter with the yellow patch, the drone on top, which is in reference to the Islamic resistance of Iraq. And then you have obviously the Houthis downing ships in the water. And then an infographic on the right, you have a release from Hezbollah after the 200th day of the Al-Aqsa flood campaign. And you could see that while Hamas is the one that originally did the attack on October 7th, they've all started to use that moniker as part of the campaign that they're conducting now in their own areas of operation, and that they're all seen as part of the same fight against Israel. So when you get to Hamas specifically, you can kind of break things down between sort of a military aspect of this as well as sort of a diplomatic campaign. When you look at sort of the way that they promote their leadership speeches, in some respects, it kind of reminds you of maybe an old school type of speech from Osama bin Laden or Ayman al-Zawahiri. There isn't anything particularly unique or special about it. It's more just a delivered speech. This is in contrast to the type of media products that we would see maybe from the Islamic State, where there'd be a lot more storytelling and dynamism in what's kind of going on in their different media products. That being said, they have tried to create some unique products. For example, this one is about their different rockets that they've used. Obviously, it's been a key part of their military operations against the different civilian populations that they've targeted within Israel. I should note that in this presentation, I'm not planning on showing any specifically violent or bloody content, and therefore I'm showing something like this instead. But when they do release their videos related to military operations, one of the things that's come up and become sort of rallying cry or something that people will use now when they're trying to support this group is that when they're targeting an Israeli tank or members of the IDF that they're fighting inside of Gaza, they'll have a red upside down triangle, essentially noting that they're targeting that particular person. And then they'll, conduct the attack on them. And now since then, you'll see in many cases with people on Twitter or other, locations where they're supporting the group, they'll have the sort of upside down red triangle emoji in their profile or something along those lines. Another aspect of their media operations is the usage of martyrs or martyrology. They've been doing this going back to the early 1990s during the original Intifada. Of course, then it wasn't in a digital manner, but this is essentially a way of showcasing people that have sacrificed for their cause. On the left side, you have one example of it from somebody that was killed while they were conducting an operation against Israel in the West Bank, actually, on behalf of Hamas. And then the right side, I think, is an important one. It was released after Salah al-Aruri, the head military commander for Hamas, when he was killed in Lebanon. And he's showcased alongside Ahmed Yassin, who is one of the founding members, as well as a key religious leader for Hamas originally, who was killed now, I think more than 20 years ago now, essentially trying to show that the sacrifices that were made, in the past continue on with what's going on now, and that there's a linkage between past sort of resistance from their perspective against Israel to what's going on now is very similar. One aspect of their campaign online that's been very interesting is actually this psychological warfare that they've been putting out in these different videos. This is one example of but there's been a number of videos similar to this where they'll sort of put out, and this is screenshots from the video itself, trying to say like, are all these hostages that we've taken killed, some of them injured, or are they all alive? And it's sort of like they're trying to preview a future video where they then show whether somebody's alive or dead. In some ways, this is part of their psychological warfare campaign against not only the Israeli government, but also I think against Israel society, because obviously for those that pay attention to what's going on there, there's a huge protest movement against the Netanyahu government to release the hostages and focus on that more so than the military campaign itself against Hamas. And therefore, Hamas tries to feed into this through this psychological warfare campaign to make it seem more urgent for the Israeli government to deal with that issue. Then when you turn to sort of the softer sides of things, Hamas has actually been engaged in a lot of diplomatic activity since October 7th. And this has picked up more and more as the months go by, especially in the last couple of months. So just to like give reference to who all these figures are, on the top left is a Hamas delegation in Moscow meeting with Russians. Top right is Hamas's Ismail Haniyeh based in Doha, meeting with I guess he's deceased now because of the helicopter crash, but former foreign minister of Iran. On the bottom right, you have Ismail Haniyeh again, meeting with the Chinese ambassador to Qatar in Doha. And then on the bottom left, one of the aspects of their diplomatic campaign is to do these meetings with various NGOs and religious figures in different countries. In this case, this is in Nigeria, and part of this is to build up legitimacy back after the October 7th attack, because, you know, it's important to remember now that we're, you know, almost 8 months since the attack itself, but in the, you know, days after, as well as maybe a week or two after, there was a lot of condemnation against Hamas, and there was more sympathy towards Israel. Obviously, a lot's changed then due to the way that Israel has conducted its war against Hamas. But because of that, Hamas has tried to build back its trust with different actors. And part of this is that in November last year, they actually put out their version of the attack. Obviously, it's based off of how they view it from their perspective, and there's a lot of disinformation in it. That being said, they've translated this into a number of languages. So not only are they able to share sort of their narrative of what happened and why to various audiences, they can provide this pamphlet when they're doing these diplomatic campaigns in different countries. And as you can see here, it's in, you know, Arabic, English, Chinese, Urdu, Spanish, Malay, Russian, there's French, there's Turkish, and then there's Urdu, or I mean Farsi, I think it said Urdu already. So that's one of the ways. And then finally, just to conclude related to Hamas, while I know that we're talking about this in the context of the GIFCT, they did create an app online. It was done through the Google store, but then it was taken down. But since you know, they've been able to get their website back online, they've been able to propagate this information online, illustrating that not all of this stuff is happening on social media, but also on these sort of, you know, old school static websites, and that some of this is also an issue in relation to service providers of these, you know, domains. Moving on to the Houthis, as you can see, there is a similarity also in the way that they put out their leadership speeches. On the top left is Abdul Malik al-Houthi, the leader of the Houthis. The bottom right is one of the top military commanders. And essentially, Abdul Malik al-Houthi puts out more religious exhortations, while on the bottom right is usually their claim of responsibility when they've done attacks against different, you know, ships, whether civilian, commercial, or military related in the Red and Indian Seas. One of the things that really, you know, put the Houthis on the map in some ways, in the way people paid attention to what they're attempting to do in relation to the various attacks against, you know, ships in the two seas, is this attack on the Galaxy leader late last year, where they're able to actually film from a helicopter where they sort of took over the ship, took everybody hostage, and then brought them back to the Yemeni shore. And these people have not been let go since. But this in some ways is unique, whereas most of their videos related to attacks on different ships have been just showing them, releasing drones from Yemeni territory and just the beginning shot of that, but not actually showing the end product of it, in part because a lot of the times they've missed or not hit anything else. And this was kind of like nobody was expecting something along those lines in this first attack, and therefore there's better defenses against it now.
And I'm going to give you a polite 2-minute, Margaret. I can't shut
yeah.
up for your case. I'm so sorry.
No worries. I'm wrapping up. And then similar to Hamas, as well as other groups, they also have, using martyrs to try and recruit more people, as well as show off people that have sacrificed on their behalf. Another aspect of the Houthis too is showcasing that there's a lot of support for them in their campaign to show that they're doing something on behalf of the Palestinians. For those that know Yemen, of course, the Houthis run it like a police state. So I think a lot of these people are out there because they're kind of forced to, not to say that people don't support Palestine, but it's also important to contextualize that as well. But it does, when put together, make it seem like there's a lot of people that back what the Houthis are doing in relation to this campaign. Finally, through this, they've also been able to recruit a bunch of people, and they've shown off all of their different military training camps that they've had over the last 7 or 8 months, illustrating and maybe trying to deter people that might want to do something militarily against the group on the ground in Yemen, and showing that they have this force that will be tough to reckon with. And then finally, one of the interesting aspects of the Houthis campaign online is sort of taking part in the BDS movement, and also talking about the different companies that have business or ties to Israel, and ones that people should not, utilize in their own daily life. Obviously easier said than done, but it is interesting that they're doing this, considering it's unlikely that a lot of these companies actually have any business in Yemen at all. Anyways, I'll leave it there. So thanks again for your time, and I'm sorry again for not seeing a lot of people in person. That would have been nice to see.
Thank you so much, Erin, for joining us virtually, although I think there'll be very few sympathies for you saying you're in Lisbon. We'll compete with you weather. The sun did just come out here in London. Again, I feel like all 4 of you, although you're covering very different parts of the world, oftentimes very different groups, there's a lot of overlap in what we're seeing, which relates to kind of all violent extremist movements, kind of using the us versus them rhetoric, bringing up the propaganda, even if you are maybe the majority in the country, seeming like you're the underdog or you're the individual being attacked, using certain celebrities or within the in-group or martyrs or individuals to kind of be that part that represents the whole, and the continued need to be online to have that wider reach and global voice.